Hello, thank you for joining us today for our discussion on the hidden element, water's vital role in economic recovery. I am Lee Rosenbaum, Associate Director for Policy and Engagement at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. Woods serves as the hub of interdisciplinary environment and sustainability research at Stanford and pursues solutions that link knowledge to action to solve environmental challenges. We do that by engaging with other leading academic institutions, government, NGOs, foundations, and media through forums like today's webinar. I have just a few housekeeping notes before I turn over to our panel. Participants' video and audio is disabled. To submit questions to the panel, which we hope you will do, please use the Q&A feature located at the menu bar either at the bottom or top of your Zoom screen. We will try to get through as many of your questions as possible today. Questions that come in through the Q&A will be read out loud to the panelists by our moderator, Hannah Northey. Hannah is a reporter with E&E News, a news organization focusing on energy and the environment. Hannah currently covers the water portfolio, but previously served as E&E's energy editor. She has also worked as a political and regulatory reporter at Argus Media in Washington, D.C., and for other news outlets in Virginia and Michigan. We are very pleased to have her guiding our discussion today. Hannah, I will now turn things over to you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome everyone to our discussion today about the hidden element, water's vital role in the economic recovery. Our goal today is to illuminate the role that water can play, water access and infrastructure can play as the nation emerges from a national pandemic. We'll discuss the weaknesses in this often overlooked system, as well as the role it could play in creating jobs, in addressing climate change, and lifting up vulnerable populations already hard hit by COVID-19. So here's the format to give you an idea of what to expect. I'm going to introduce our terrific lineup of panelists and then kick off questions that should give us an idea of some of the high-level themes that we should be thinking about. And as Lee noted, during the second half of our discussion today, we're going to open the floor up for questions. So please make sure to jot those down and have them on hand when we open it up to the Q&A session. Sound good? Then we'll start right now and I will introduce our panelists. Here today we have with us Nusha Ajami. She is the Director of Urban Water Policy with Stanford University's Water in the West and NSF Renew It initiatives. She's a hydrologist and a leading expert in sustainable water resource management, water policy, the water energy food nexus, and advancing uncertainty assessment techniques impacting hydrological predictions. Dr. Ajami is also a two-term appointee to the Bay Area Regional Water Quality Control Board. We also have with us Joseph Kane. He's a senior research associate and associate fellow with the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. Joe's work focuses on a wide array of built environment issues, including transportation and water infrastructure. And before joining Brookings, Joe was an economist with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And with us today, we also have Alessandra Nahara, a program officer on the Water Foundation's Healthy Communities team, where she develops and implements grant-making programs and strategies to ensure residents across the U.S. have safe and reliable drinking water. She also helps lead programs to build resilient rural communities and to advance water efficiency and conservation in California. Before joining the Water Foundation, she served as a legislative assistant to Democratic California Senator Barbara Boxer and Congressman John Garamendi. So I would like to start opening the floor for questions. The first one is on affordability. So even before the pandemic, water rates were rising, an average 8.8% in the US for the past 5 years. And that was due to infrastructure needs, increasingly extreme storms, and concern about water quality. Now, in the middle of an ongoing pandemic and economic crisis, millions of Americans are facing rising and unaffordable bills for running water, and they risk being disconnected and losing their homes even if they can't pay. So the question, and I'm going to throw this first over to Joe, is what are the hurdles in addressing water affordability? And what do we do about this cost of infrastructure colliding with the ability of households to pay?
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to the Stanford team for organizing this. I think this will be a great discussion. So it's a big question, and I think the key phrase, Hannah, that you mentioned is that these issues existed before COVID, right? It's not as if all of a sudden water affordability became an issue, but these issues have been evolving for quite some time, both from sort of the household perspective of individuals actually being able to afford to pay for their water bills, but actually also infrastructure owners and operators, including utilities, to make the needed infrastructure investments that we need. And so, I mean, just a couple quick stats that over the past decade, when we think of monthly residential water bills, Circle of Blue has run surveys on this across the country where we've seen a greater than 50% increase in some of those bills. If we look at the consumer price index, when we combine our water and sewer prices together, we've actually seen a doubling in rates going back to 2000. So it's really been this not just sort of this economic hit to households, but really this I would argue this age of infrastructure that we're in, where we're seeing a lot of aging systems. We're in an era of repair and replacement, and so utilities have a lot of costs to balance, in addition to providing affordable, equitable service that's just so essential, especially now, where we're realizing just for our environment, for hygiene, for so many different purposes. And so these trends have been unfolding for some time. The challenges, unfortunately, are getting more severe. There have been moratoria from some cities in terms of limiting actual shutoffs of service, but what I like to say is that the scale of this challenge varies so much across the country. What's true in California can be different from what we're seeing in the Midwest, the East Coast. But overall, this is a big challenge that I think deals with questions around infrastructure investment, in addition to questions around household economic conditions and actually ability to pay for some of these bills.
And I'll add to that a little bit. First of all, lovely to be here. Thank you so much for your efforts, Hannah, to moderating this panel, and for our team for putting this together. I think Joe touched on so many very important points here, which is sort of focuses on rising rates and the issues around aging infrastructure. And I think I'll add to that also climate change, which is sort of impacted the way our water systems works, and then the challenges on the additional challenge on our infrastructure management. But one point that I wanted to add to Joe's comments here is, affordability is a tricky issue, because sometimes by not recovering the cost of service that's provided to people, we actually end up impacting the lowest or most disadvantaged members of our community, because if we are not investing in our infrastructure due to not having enough money as coming in as a revenue, then it actually ends up this lack of investments is going to sort of lead to lack of access to clean water for some of the people who don't have money to go buy filters to make sure their water is clean, or actually they may need to go buy more bottled water to provide the need for their daily demand on water. So it is one of those issues that's very important to focus on and to study. And I think it has so many different angles and dimensions that are worth paying attention to, in addition to just raising rates. It actually has other dimensions that needs to come into discussion. And that part of it comes also down to rate setting process that's happening at the water utilities, which are often, it's kind of outdated, and it's not necessarily reflects the need for revenue for some of these utilities. And actually lack of that leads to lack of investment in better infrastructure, new infrastructure. For example, some of the issues we see around affordability sort of rises from leaks that happens in the system that end up adding to people's bills that is undetected for months. And then you go back and it's very hard for people to pay that bill because their system have been leaking for 2 months. And now it's like a huge burden for them to pay for it. But if we had, for example, a smart meter, maybe that would have been detected much earlier and we could have stopped that earlier. So it's kind of like, it's a very complex issue that's really requires much more attention and focus.
Yeah.
I'll chime in as well here, Hannah, and just want to echo my fellow panelists. Thanks to Stanford for hosting this conversation and Hannah for shepherding us today. I think it's really important to set the context before we dive into the immediate impacts of COVID. So I think, you know, the challenges that my fellow panelists have highlighted are really important in terms of the decline in federal investment in our aging water infrastructure over time. I also want to highlight a few other pieces that have contributed, including cost of treatment due to emerging contaminants and not holding polluters responsible for cleanup of those emerging contaminants. As another factor, the larger economic context that we're facing in America of growing inequality and stagnating wages, driving the inaffordability that we're seeing in water rates right now. And finally, the lack of low-income rate assistance programs paralleling other sectors like energy and telecommunications as contributing factors to the rising water rates and the inaffordability that we'll be discussing as an outcome of the pandemic and the recession today.
Yeah. Thank you. That leads into our next question, which is also about affordability, but the pandemic, and it has to do with moratoria. And across the country, we're seeing governor's moratoria on drinking water shutoffs expiring. Now, some are calling for Congress to make that a national moratorium during the pandemic, but utilities have warned that this is going to create a multi-billion-dollar hole in their annual revenues and exacerbate this problem of bills not being paid. So the question here, and Alessandra, I'm going to throw this one out to you first, is, you know, what's the answer here? Are there promising strategies for how the utilities can, you know, juggle keeping the water flowing for essential needs while remaining solvent?
Sure. Again, another big question that I'm looking forward to having some discussion with our panelists here. The coalitions that we've been funding at the Water Foundation have been prioritizing kind of 4 key prongs, which include low-income rate assistance programs to directly help customers. And then there's kind of the other, coming at the problem from the other angle, which is emergency assistance to utilities at the federal level. Additional funding for the drinking water and clean water state revolving funds. And then finally, continuing shutoff moratoria, and most importantly, prioritizing reconnections and payment plans once the pandemic or state of emergency ends. So those are kind of 4 big pieces that I think we continue to talk about. I think another key aspect will be data collection at the state level on how all of these programs are working. So North Carolina, I think, has the most impressive program that I've seen in terms of collecting data on water shutoffs so that we can have information on how these programs are working. I know in North Carolina, I think they found about 321,000 customer accounts are past due right now at the end of June. 2/3 of them are eligible for shutoff, and North Carolina suppliers also reported 5.77 million in arrears at this point. So having that information as the pandemic and the following recession continue will allow us to understand whether these programs are functioning and where we can make tweaks in the future.
Joe or Nisha, do you want to?
I'll add to that. Actually, one thing that that we have been focusing on a lot and highlighting is actually the challenge of some of the regulatory limitations that we have in providing those lifeline assistance. For example, as Alessandra mentioned, telecommunication and energy. We pay about 6% of our telephone bills or cell phone bills actually is what goes into rural infrastructure support to make sure that everybody has access to telecommunication. Now in California, we have had similar thing through public goods charge for energy, which actually used to dedicate a portion of it to help create this lifeline assistance for rising cost of energy and making sure everybody has access to energy. Now for water, for example, in California, we have Proposition 218, which actually does not allow for water utilities to take the revenue and reallocate it to something beyond whatever service they're providing. So you can take somebody's bill and say, okay, this portion of it can go help, you know, this is Joe's bill and it can help Nusha's water bill because that is reallocating money. And this has been an issue for many years. There have been a lot of discussion on trying to actually make sure taking water out of this limitation. Actually, electricity sector at a time, make sure they're grandfathered in and they are not part of this Prop 218, but water is. So this actually has caused problems with not only water, but sewer and also stormwater issues. And a couple of years ago, we finally were able to sort of take stormwater out of it as well. So it's just some of these legal and regulatory limitations can really put sort of like a stop point for some of these strategies that are essential and important in order to help affordability and making sure everybody have access to water.
I would just quickly add, all obviously terrific points. You know, I think we have to look at where the financial responsibility has been up to this point when we think of our water infrastructure needs, and I'm including drinking water, wastewater, stormwater. You know, greater than 90% of our annual public spending every year is at that state and local level, and there has been a retrenchment in federal support just for all water infrastructure, to say nothing of this affordability question. And so, you know, the onus has been and continues to be on states and localities to address this. And what we know, particularly in this, you know, COVID age, is that states and localities are having tremendous constraints in so many other areas, whether it's education, other social service programs. And so water isn't just living on its own sort of, you know, planet. It has to be balanced alongside some of these other very pressing budget concerns. And so that, I think, you know, Hannah, leads to questions of, you know, is there a role for greater national and federal involvement in these conversations? And this hasn't been just isolated to water services. You know, water, in my view, is sort of the head of the infrastructure dragon, right? Where, you know, it's not, the household can't choose between their water bill, or they shouldn't have to choose between their water bill, their energy bill, and their broadband bill. It's all a bundle of services that are all essential at the moment. And so the question is going to be, where is the responsibility going to fall if states and localities have been the primary ones to solve a lot of this, but they don't have a lot of extra capacity? Is there a federal impetus or a national impetus for action here?
Hannah, just one thing actually to Joe's point. I think he highlighted something very important, which is the reality that water is such a local issue and people handle it in a local way. So lack of federal leadership in some of these issues. For example, the tax that I mentioned on telecommunication actually goes into this federal universal service fund that actually gets distributed among different states and different rural communities, which we, like, the question here would be like, so where would such a thing would go if we want to reallocate it among people equally for people if they need them? So the fragmentation in the water sector is really hurting us, no matter if it's a governance structure or the way we sort of manage water. Both those fragmentations are hurting the way we are actually providing services to everybody and bringing water to everybody, especially disadvantaged communities.
So this next question kind of dovetails off of that conversation, because in Washington, D.C., it's always Infrastructure Week, as we all know. And so as we emerge from this pandemic, what should we be focusing on? This was something we talked about early. What is the infrastructure that we should be building? And, it's kind of well known that there's this huge backlog of all of these projects that need to be done to upgrade the system. American Society of Civil Engineers gave the nation's water infrastructure a D rating in 2017. EPA does the reoccurring surveys of water utilities, and that shows that there's more than $470 billion needed to maintain and improve the nation's drinking water infrastructure over the next 2 decades. So to me, the question, being new to the water beat as well, so what kind of infrastructure should we be looking at? And how do you allocate the funds in the most appropriate and innovative ways, but also with equity in mind? That's a lot to tackle when states are feeling the pinch. So, Alessandra, do you want to try that one first?
Sure, I'll take the first swing at it and see what my fellow panelists have to add. I think I would be remiss in not saying that there's just an incredible amount of evidence for distributed infrastructure and one water solutions that provide both ecosystem and human benefits at a lower cost potentially even than traditional gray infrastructure, while also addressing some of the impacts of climate change. However, in my work at Water Foundation right now in the Healthy Communities portfolio, I think we've been focused on kind of a slightly different way of looking at this question, which is how do we focus on equitable access to either infrastructure that exists or infrastructure that we build in the future, and how do we fund it, and who receives the funding, I think has been part of the important questions that we don't always focus on when we're just looking at increasing the numbers in these infrastructure funding pots.
Mhm.
So, you know, lack of investment in infrastructure leads to rising operations and maintenance costs, and those operations and maintenance costs particularly impact small systems that are disadvantaged and can't afford to maintain even the infrastructure that they already have, even if they are able to access capital funding, say for a new drinking water treatment plant. If they can't operate it, we're kind of at an impasse. So equity and access to that funding has been kind of the single biggest factor of whether or not you experience kind of systemic embedded racism in our country. And so our focus has really been on how are there ways that we can ensure that there are funding set asides for disadvantaged or small and rural communities that have difficulty accessing the funding that exists.
Mhm.
I think some of the ways that there have been creative solutions have been, again, percentage set asides of funding for these communities. There have also been creative solutions in terms of waiving requirements for grant applications, switching from loans to grant programs. So I'm looking forward to discussing with my colleagues how we can both ensure that there is new infrastructure funding and then how we ensure that infrastructure funding is distributed in an equitable way.
I'll just quickly add, Hannah, you know, we can't just lead with the dollar signs here, you know, and you know, we can't just, as much as I'm sure utilities and others wouldn't complain if a bunch of money rained down on them to pay for all this stuff. I mean, that would help, obviously, but we are fundamentally, again, in a different era right now than when we built out a lot of this stuff. I mean, our water systems, you know, date back in some cases to the 19th century, and they were not built for a time of where we're living in climate extremes, tremendous economic inequality and accessibility concerns. So we need to ask ourselves before we just start throwing money at projects, you know, what's the vision? What's the 21st century vision for water? And that in many ways, we're at an inflection point right now that it shouldn't be an either or sort of conversation or choice, right? That, hey, there might be a way that we can see water per sort of the conversation we're having today. How can water be sort of this platform for growth, for equity? What are our sort of non-infrastructure objectives, if you will, that we want to see be reflected in our systems? Because, you know, quite frankly, our infrastructure has done and continues to serve us, right, as an essential service. But I would argue, right, there are serious questions about the affordability of it, the sustainability of it. And so we are at this new inflection point now where at least national leaders need to help, in my view, need to help sort of that innovation, that capacity that's so desperately needed. That's not just financial, but in terms of vision to what we need to strive for here. And I think Alessandra, you know, hit the nail on its head, right? That we need to have these questions. It's about people, right? It can't just be getting a bunch of projects done for infrastructure's sake, but actually how are we serving communities in ways that are more affordable, sustainable, and so on.
I mean,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Nusha. No, to me, that raises the question of should that vision come from the federal or from the state or local level? So maybe you could touch on that.
Yeah, I'll be quick, and then Nusha, I'm sure you'll
No worries, go ahead.
pile onto this. Look, I think it has to be all of the above, right? It's not going to be the federal government in Washington sort of, you know, coming down from the ivory tower with the tablets, you know, this is what it's going to be. The reality is, and the reality will continue to be that, you know, we have 50,000 plus water utilities across the country. There are highly localized specific needs for a reason. And, you know, I'm so happy, I think Alessandra, you brought this up well as well. You know, measurement, you know, defining sort of the performance of our systems and what's needed here. The water space is, you know, quite frankly, from a researcher's perspective, it's a nightmare to begin to even gauge what some of the needs are here. And so this is a challenge that's in other infrastructure sectors at the moment too, of rethinking what are the performance measures in transportation and energy, focused on again, issues of equity, climate issues, et cetera, where we can't just rely on the same measures that we've been relying on for so long. But it is a challenge where we do need to be responsive to these local needs, and hopefully those local needs, right, can inform a national approach on this. But it really has to be, I think, all of the above. It has to be a federal, state, local buy-in based on sort of clearly defined objectives and then better metrics to actually understand how we are holding ourselves accountable to those goals over time.
Nusha, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, maybe since we touched on a lot of these different things, I'll sort of summarize it and maybe give it a different sort of a cover. So, we live in an era that we are governed by these rules that were put in place during the 20th century and 19th century. They're, governed by some of the laws from the 19th century, right? And we have built this infrastructure in the past century, which is sort of like outdated, not flexible. Actually, the biggest disconnect there is also the infrastructure is disconnected from people. Disconnecting people from their source, sorry. So they're not necessarily understanding where what water is coming from, where it's going, what are they paying for really, right? So there's this disconnect that is sort of has created this fundamental problem with water is coming out of the tap, somebody will take care of it after it's done. I don't even know what percentage of people, honestly, I think 90% of people don't even know what is going on with their water after they use it. So, so this disconnect is an issue. And then on top of that, we are not going, my team is we have been sort of studying this distributed systems, from so many different angles. And I think they're very, very important as part of the conversation for this century, because they can create flexibility in the system. But one thing that's important about them is actually they can extend the life of our existing infrastructure, which actually not only is at the end of its lifespan, it's also not necessarily having capacity to meet the new pressures that's being put on it, right? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like this distributed systems we need to have some sort of a hybrid system that would include both distributed systems and the existing centralized system that we have to kind of to expand service and also extend the life of what we have. So these two elements are extremely important. Now, so how do you do that is a different question. For example, if you look at the energy sector, you look at the one thing that worked in California very well was establishing these renewable energy portfolios, which allowed flexibility around how do you make infrastructure and create renewable energy without necessarily being prescriptive of what do you need to put in place. The same thing needs to happen for water, sort of having some sort of a diversified water portfolio that allows different communities to evaluate what they have, how they can expand their resiliency, how they can improve their access, and make sure they can, have a more water resilient future, which is one piece. The second piece is actually, which Alessandra touched on, is information. We are in an era that we're gathering information so many different ways, and people actually are in the center of this information gathering. They are actually the information provider and user at the same time. And that actually is missing in the water sector. We are not necessarily engaging customers and people as part of the decision-making process in water. And that's impacting the way we think about infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So when you talk about infrastructure, we talk about how can we build the next supply to bring water to all the people who need water without knowing what they need really. Do we really need to flush down our highly clean water down the toilet? Do we really need to use that water to water our lawns? How can we just sort of have a different kind of infrastructure model that addresses these discrepancies in the way we use water, right? So the question is very complex, And the answer can be very complex, but actually some of these discussions need to happen if we really want to have a water resilient future that's much more thoughtful and less one-dimensional. Water comes, we treat it, we provide it to people, they use it for whatever purpose it is, and then they actually discard it and they never think about it, right? How do you create that circularity in the system to make sure people value their water, they use it differently, and they know where it comes and where it goes? So that connection is key. And I think, and I hope that this eventually would bring in a different way of measuring success in the water sector, which is much less sort of deterministic. I want to have a wastewater treatment plants that provide this much treatment for this many gallons of water for this many people, right? Rather than that, it needs to be focused on what are my objectives, right? I want to make sure I serve the environment, I serve the people, I serve everybody in the community, and also bring equity. None of these right now is part of our performance matrices that we have around infrastructure. Our infrastructure's success is not measured based on human perception or environmental needs. It's very much of an engineering approach, which as an engineer, I appreciate because it's easy. It's an easy problem to have a very specific problem and then specify a solution to that specific problem and hope for the best. Yeah. But our world is much more complex.
So that actually leads into the next question, an issue that we've also all discussed, and that is you're talking about a system that's removed from the people, that doesn't actually fit in, that's not flexible, that maybe doesn't meet certain goals. So what about a system that needs to be more resilient or is more modern or more flexible? I was amazed to learn that obviously lead pipes are from the Victorian era and we're cleaning up that mess today. So how do you elevate the discussions around water in climate talks, for example? How do you make the system more resilient? I report on everything from sewage overflows to, Nusha, you just tipped me off to the effects of wildfires on the plastic systems out in California and benzene. So how do you elevate that issue? And then how do you make the system more resilient? Nusha, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So I think, climate change is, the intersection of climate change and COVID is a very interesting intersection in a way that, climate change is something that people sort of think it's happening, or maybe it's happening, or some people think it's not happening. But, it is actually really very much slowly highlighting the flaws in our existing system in so many different ways, through floodings, through fires, through drought, extended droughts. It's just every part of the country in the US, when you look at, people are suffering from different ways of infrastructure being compromised due to climate change. And COVID-19 is actually, in a way, it was a very quick sort of environmental stressor that even further highlighted these issues, because we have really a system that is not resilient right now and is actually falling apart because of it. So, so it's kind of like, so when you talk about resiliency around that, then it comes down to, how do you fund a future project that is actually much more flexible? And what does that mean? What does flexibility mean? That's another definition we need to have. Does it mean to make sure that people can, having pipelines? So for example, benzene, you brought it up, some of these pipes are over the ground, right? They're plastic, the wildfires are surging and they're melting, right? And was putting those plastic pipes on the ground was a good idea? Having them underground, would that be a good idea? Do we really need to rely on plastic pipes? Is that what we want the future to look like? Another piece with wildfire, which is I constantly say, and I know it's not necessarily that popular, but it's very important to remember, is sometimes these natural disasters are giving us an opportunity to rethink the way we do things. With fires is a great example. We want everybody to recover as fast as they can. But does that mean that you have to tell them to do the same thing that they did before? Just rebuild as fast as you can, the same thing you had. Or do we actually step back and say, We know people are suffering, but let's help them to build a future that's much more thoughtful, resilient, appropriate for the problems we have right now, and embedded with the solutions that belongs to this century rather than the previous century, right? And that's not something that we are doing right now. So I think every one of these disasters is a way of highlighting these problems and is an opportunity to rethink the sort of the flaws in the system we are right now have.
We have one grantee who was working in Lake County, which was recently devastated by fires a few years ago, who was working on a consolidation solution prior to the fires for 5 small struggling water systems in the area. And it wasn't until after fire devastated the area that they were able to convince some of the local water board members to kind of come together to talk about forming one system that might be more resilient in the future. And so how do we try to harness the threat of climate change to try and make some of those steps in progress before the crisis happens? But as so often happens in politics, a crisis is a good way to create policy change in the future. And I think that voters are starting to reflect some of that too. I know the Water Hub at Climate Nexus recently did polling around these questions and found that pollution of water sources is one of the biggest threats they identified to safe drinking water. There's huge 70 to 80% support for federal funding for low-income rate assistance for water systems. And so I think people are noticing these changes, and there is a change in public support, which is a really important piece to getting some of this done politically. I know we've been talking about the limitations of some of the federal policies and state level laws that limit our ability to be creative. But it's the activism that we see from impacted communities at the Water Foundation that has created immense policy change at the state level, and I think can also create that change at the local and federal level as well. So if we have, trying to be as creative as we can with federal funding through the tools that we already have, bring in state level expertise that doesn't necessarily need to have funding behind it. If it's, technical assistance, translation services to make sure that materials are going out in different languages that people can use, and technical assistance again to small water systems that don't have a large enough customer base to keep operating. I think we can find some creative ways to have the public drive new solutions.
And I would just quickly add, Hannah, water is climate, right? I mean, it's not like, again, water is by itself here. And so much of even why we're having the conversation today is about visibility. It's about community buy-in, creating an intuitive, understandable message, not just for water experts talking to other water experts, but I mean, economic development officials, developers, they all have to understand their role in this. Land use, I would argue, why are we building close to shorelines where we're seeing repeated floods right now, right, in Alabama and the Gulf Coast again? It shouldn't take these disasters to be the continual, alarm clock and we're pressing the snooze button until the next one comes. It's unacceptable. It's leading to huge costs for the federal government. It's leading to huge human costs in individual communities. So I would say, the visibility, the community buy-in is important here. In addition to, and I think it's so important, Nusha, how you brought up flexibility. I would add to that capacity, right? And in capacity, I would think there's financial capacity, right? That places just can't keep borrowing more money to pay for these projects. A lot of places, have balanced budget requirements. We're in a very tough time to even, I think it's a lot of people agree, right? We're clearly vulnerable to these climate pressures, but where's the money going to come from? It's not just the money, but the leadership capacity. That it shouldn't just be the same places you kind of hear about that are kind of experimenting with new ways to think about these issues. Who are the people, right? Who are the leaders in these communities who are going to be driving this change? So when I think of capacity, it's both financial, but also sort of that human capacity. Because again, it's going to be people that are going to have to drive these decisions. It's not just going to be one project, right, that's going to solve everything. It's going to be that leadership and that proactive leadership that understands that they just can't keep kicking the can on these issues.
Hannah, I'll add something. I think you asked this question, and I'm glad Joe brought it up again, which is this whole climate and water connection, which often drives me crazy because I see so many people constantly talk about climate change as if it's only about mitigation. And water is constantly missing in some of the climate change discussions. If it's about policy, if it's about funding, it's about financial efforts. Like I work with so many different corporations that sometimes water is this invisible thing that nobody thinks about. Yes, flooding and droughts and water scarcity is an issue. They do realize that, but when they talk about climate change or how to mitigate the impacts of climate change, the water is never part of those priorities that are brought up. It's all about renewable energy and how do you, go carbon free. Which is important. I'm not saying it's not important, but I think water should be at the center of those discussions, and it's right now missing. And I think the problem with something like that is the consequences that we are going to have in the future by not including water in these discussions. The same problems we are dealing with right now, having these siloed discussions around energy, transportation, and water, and not understanding their interconnections. And then now we are dealing with some of those challenges today. So that's one thing. The second thing I want to say, again, Joe brought up the borrowing as a habit that we have in the water sector, partly because of the lack of funding. And in the same research we were doing on public goods charge for water, one thing we noticed is that in the past, just paying back for the bonds, water bonds, California have passed in the past 10, 15 years. Every household in California is paying between $80 to $120 a year to pay back those bonds, only water. And think about the fact that this is just not paying back the bond, but actually paying back the cost of the bond and the money that's borrowed, right? So it's a debt that you're paying back. And the argument here is, what if people pay upfront for these things rather than constantly borrowing and adding to our debt pool, and then eventually not even being able to benefit from the dollars we are raising through these bonds? So this business model we have in water is very much outdated. And in addition to our infrastructure, I think first thing that needs attention is the governance and business model we have in the water sector that's very outdated and very rigid. And it's not necessarily open to new thinking and new ways of managing the system.
So we had, water, yes, it's not too prominent in the climate discussions. It is in the moment being used. It's mentioned in the Democratic platform, and in the, we've seen President Trump go to different places to highlight the Great Lakes or the Everglades. We've seen that recently. So that kind of brings me to political leadership that you were talking about, Joe. And I wanted just to ask, so what, we're looking for leadership, you're talking about finance. What are the pieces of legislation, or maybe who are the champions on Capitol Hill? Like how does Congress play into all of this and to finding a solution?
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's timely. I mean, again, the reality is, states and localities remain in the driver's seat. Like, let's be clear, like our water investment needs are not going to magically shift, to the federal government. But the federal government is an important partner and player in these conversations, and hopefully those conversations turn to actions. I'll just say from my vantage point, the reality in the next few months, I don't see a huge water infrastructure push happening in a stimulus bill. I mean, there are so many. I don't need to say this to viewers on here today. There are so many things happening right now. Beyond, not to underplay the importance of water, but probably the most important thing that could be happening, at least in Congress, if there was additional state and local assistance. There have been conversations of $500 billion or more going to states and localities to cover a whole bunch of services. Water, I assume, would be, an infrastructure, I assume, would be part of that. With that said, something that a lot of people don't realize at the federal level is that we have passed water legislation. So the Water Resources Development Act, or WRDA, has been passed pretty consistently over the last few years. It gets renewed about every 2 years or so. Now that legislation is primarily geared towards U.S. Army Corps of Engineer projects, sort of inland waterway projects. So it isn't really this expansive water bill per se that's going to touch all types of utilities and drinking water concerns and wastewater concerns. And then, there have been actions within agencies, EPA, which has been, bashed for many different environmental topics at the moment. They have come out with a new program, the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, or WIFIA program. So looking at new ways to provide low-cost lending and loan assistance to communities. That's a nimble model that has emerged. So it's easy to just focus on sort of the challenge here, but there are sort of, some of these nascent federal actions we're seeing, and it does matter, that certainly on the campaign trail and within the White House at the moment, that infrastructure remains that talking point. So, I don't have a crystal ball. No one does. It's a bipartisan issue. It's always talked about, but it does come down to these very thorny questions that have existed for decades around money, around vision. And so that's why we just haven't seen that big action necessarily around this.
One thing I would say is one positive thing about WRDA that Joe mentioned is I noticed there's a lot more conversation about resilience in there and sort of paying attention to social and ecological benefits, which are often a challenge when you're dealing with being on a regional board. We do try to promote green infrastructure, nature-based solutions over some of the more rigid engineering solutions that are very popular or at least easy to implement by different agencies. And we have often had problems sort of trying to find a common ground, at least with the Army Corps sometimes, to kind of have them fund some of these kind of projects. They're supporting it, but they're not able to fund them sometimes. And I was sort of happy to see that there is a little bit of a discussion around trying to change the way we approach these nature-based solutions and focusing a little bit more on ecological and environmental challenges. And so.
Yeah, I'll just chime in quickly and just agree that it seems like it's fairly unlikely, although it's always possible that another stimulus package will pass before the election. It seems like the majority of any substantial water language will likely be waiting until after the election or into 2021. There has been talk of kind of broad local government assistance that cities and localities could use to prioritize water infrastructure, although that would kind of distribute the decision-making kind of unevenly across the US. There have been bills that have passed off the House floor, like the Moving Forward Act, that would help with water infrastructure capital. Some of that will depend on whether or not there's a flip in the Senate, if that is able to pass in early 2021. Finally, Representative Huffman said on a Water Now panel recently that there could be an opportunity to link WRDA and some either SRF changes or funding increases, which is fairly unusual, but as we're all aware, in the last legislature, WRDA did include language that doesn't normally just encompass the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So it's a possibility that since WRDA has become kind of a must-pass bill, that there's an opportunity for additional policy tweaking of the kind that Nusha just talked about.
Yeah, I'm definitely stalking out WRDA as it moves through Congress, and that actually, I'm going to open this discussion up to the Q&A session now, and it actually does go into WRDA, which is kind of interesting. Ayana Bodhi has one question, and they're asking, how can water infrastructure improvements be married with climate change mitigation and adaptation? The issues that we're currently facing. For example, do you see a role for natural infrastructure and conserving source headwaters as a way to both capture water and increase water quality while also restoring landscapes and sequestering carbon? And that's interesting, right? Because that language is in the WRDA bill. So obviously there's a political will there for that, for those policies. Whoever wants to take that question, I think that's interesting. Can you marry these infrastructure improvements with climate change?
I think absolutely. I mean, I'll just jump in. I think this language that we have in WORDA is really definitely encouraging. And I think this whole watershed approach to water management, or it's more of an integrated approach to water management, is really, really key. And I think, the question is very much touching on that, which is, we have to think, so let me give you an example. We constantly talk about data centers, which is sort of like, for me, it's this forgotten child that is right now depending on a lot of resources to make sure they're cool, and they're actually put in certain places sometimes that are water scarce, right? So, but we are using that data to do a lot of different things, and everybody is excited about, talking about how, they're using these data centers to analyze data. And I'm one of those people who uses a lot of this big data. But, we are having an environmental impact right there and then in whatever community we are putting these data centers without necessarily talking about them. Right. So this watershed approach, this question it sort of touches on, is very much highlights that how every decision we make, regardless is related to energy or climate or water, it can actually have multi-benefits and multi-effects that has to continuously be considered as part of the decision making. It's difficult, it's complicated, as I said earlier, but is essential. If you really want to have a world that we can live in the next 50 years and our children can live in the next 50 years, we actually have to think about these consequences and be able to take the time and make better decisions rather than waiting for every disaster to come and then jump on it with whatever solution we had in our books from 50 years ago and try to sort of stamp it on as fast as we can to make sure everybody's happy.
I would add to that, WORDA is a good start, but we're not going to solve all of this through WORDA. And so I like to think bigger than that, and not just bigger in terms of, we need more funding around this, but we do need leadership on these issues. So I do look towards some of the agencies on this, EPA, FEMA, in particular. I mean, the National Flood Insurance Program, if you've been following the news, has been close to insolvency, or there's serious concerns since our current model is based on relief, not resilience. So there has to be I would say questions for sure on again measurement, performance measurement, how we're gauging success here, all geared towards resilience, not just relief. And then, I think having an eye towards the federal government, not just being seen as sort of holding a stick, forcing places to do this, but providing carrots, with the stick. So it's not like, EPA saying you have a combined sewer overflow issue, and you have to comply with this, otherwise you're going to face some sort of penalty. But how can the federal government incentivize proactive investment? And this is where I do see opportunities, not just from the federal coffers, but for the private market potentially. There's a lot of private capital sitting on the sidelines, and I'm not saying we need to do public-private partnerships across the country. That's very short-sighted. There's a reason that these are highly nuanced transactions that last for decades, and there just haven't been many across the country for good reason. Trump administration and their infrastructure plan a couple years ago tried to have more of this private-led investment. But I do think that, as we've seen in sort of Wall Street, the appetite for ESG investment, so sort of environmental, social sort of governance, the growth of green bonds, the potential for environmental impact bonds. There are different sort of private avenues that are still very small, where there hasn't been much demonstrated federal leadership on even defining what these could mean at a local level. So I just think we need to put all the tools on the table here. We cannot just limit ourselves to sort of the existing legislation, WORDA, which is great that it keeps moving here, but we really need to have an eye towards what are the full range of options here for not just the coming year, but the coming years.
I just wanted to remind attendees to write questions in the Q&A box if you do want to add anything else to ask. I'm going to ask something that kind of dovetails off that from Dennis O'Connor. And Dennis wrote that, you know, he's asking about the detail about what is a resilient water system. You know, what are the actual characteristics of a resilient water system? Is there a way, you know, kind of digging down on those details? Are there characteristics, not just, you know, not flexibility or adaptability, but like, are there, you know, more details?
So I'll jump in because we did a study on this. And, you know, I think Dennis's question is very important, which sort of touches on the fact that there's no very specific definition of resiliency. I keep repeating the word resilient and can mean different things to different people. We did a study, we looked at the Bay Area and tried to look and see how resiliency can be defined from a water systems perspective. And the way we defined it was you have to actually look, the idea was you want to make sure communities have access to water for, you know, they can handle different environmental stressors or different social stressors and still be able to access water. And the way we defined improved resiliency was having diverse set of solutions or diverse set of water solutions in their pocket, so that they can actually easily switch from one source to another if something happens to one source. And another piece of this was actually, you don't need to have, the idea is not to have 10 different sources and each one of those sources are only a little bit, because you still are not increasing your resiliency if you only have a very small amount of your water supply relying on a very small source. The idea is you have enough of that source in that bucket that can actually carry you on for a while. Another piece, again, that goes into that, the resilience measurement, is actually looking bottom up, which means looking at demand diversity. Everybody thinks about supply as the only way of measuring resilience for the future. We need to have more water supply infrastructure to bring water to us. Our argument is actually you have to look at demand diversity, meaning if you actually have diverse set of demands, for example, for you know, industrial water use, for household water use, for you know, commercial buildings. Each one of these people, each one of these sectors have their own kind of need for water, and the water that can go to them doesn't need to be the same quality, the same form, the same shape. That means that you can create more flexibility in your system to bring different amount of water to them or different quality of water to them without necessarily putting a lot of stress on your environment. So eventually, as you sort of look at resiliency from that lens, you're actually bringing in environmental impact a little bit in, and also at the same time creating more, a wider portfolio of solutions, and also while to meet some of the wider portfolio of demands that exist there. So that's how we in my team have been defining resilience. And the idea of resilience, another piece I'll add to that is, because water is very local, it can look very different from one community to another. You can't say everybody's water supply should come, 20% of everyone's water supply should come from recycling, because maybe a community have a different option available to them. Or you can't say like 10% should come from desalination, because maybe desalination is not even an option for some of these communities. It needs to be a more of a skeleton option of diversify, make sure you have enough in each one of those buckets, and let these local communities, and provide incentives, as Joe said, and then let these communities to work within their own opportunities and limitations to build that diversification, to build resilience.
We also take an approach to resilience that is strongly locally driven and particularly centers local residents. The way we at the Water Foundation have defined resilience is the capacity of communities to proactively avoid and respond to water-related shocks and disturbances in a way that minimizes harm, spurs renewal, equity, and system health. So given the challenges of rapid climate change, this requires a systematic approach that tackles the kind of the underlying causes that often go beyond the context of what we think of as water infrastructure. So this can be community engagement, democratic engagement in decision-making processes, such as engagement in local water boards, the availability and diversity of economic opportunity, and community health and cohesion. And so it's easy, maybe it's easier sitting from a philanthropic seat to talk about some of these kind of broader social constructs, but I think it's really important that we don't lose that locally driven community perspective in sourcing some of these solutions, because otherwise we could end up with infrastructure that doesn't fit the local communities, that doesn't fit their ability to pay, and doesn't provide the kind of resilient cushioning that we were talking about here today.
Yeah, I mean, resilience is just one of those buzzwords. I can't speak for the other panelists, but for me, it's like you hear smart cities, or you hear like, there's just like one of these, it's like, yeah, this is important, we should be doing it, but there are no real standards around this nationally. We have no real conception of, what are the climate costs and the climate benefits when we make resilient sort of improvements. Often it might be seen just purely as Nusha, you pointed out, just sort of this mitigation angle versus the adaptation angle. So, again, goes back to, Brad, glad you brought it up at the beginning, Alessandra, measurement, right? Like, what do we even mean? Like, how are we measuring and holding ourselves accountable for, resilience? And right now we just don't have those standards really in place. Not to say that would not magically help every place to achieve greater resilience, but it is a starting point. Whereas I think right now, from the standpoint, you can imagine, I'm sure some viewers now who probably work for utilities, it's like, yeah, what are your opinions on resilience? They're like, that seems like such a global macro force. Like, doesn't the UN have a definition on like sustainable development goals? It's not really locally defined and customized and scored and measured in ways that really make sense, I would argue. And so that's going to be a part of this process as well.
One other thing I want to add, Hannah, to this conversation is it's very easy, again, to focus on solutions rather than thinking about the existing problems we have. And I think one thing that we constantly in my team talk about is, again, going back to governance. If you want to build resiliency, you have to think about governance. And governance means having diverse financial options or financing portfolios, a more flexible way of setting rates, a better way of measuring outcome, there's so many different things that goes into the governance of our water system that needs to be revisited and reevaluated before we actually just jump into, all we need is more, gray water systems and recycling plants and desalination plants. It's just because technology is there. It's not the problem of technology. It's about how do you create a system that can incorporate these technologies in the right way, which would not burden our system further in the future, right? We don't want to leave communities that don't have resources behind with the aging infrastructure on their neck and saying, you are the one who only is connected to this system and you are the one who is going to pay for it for the rest of your lives, right? So when you look at the energy sector, I always think energy sector, thank God they're ahead of us a little bit, because you can see where they're going and you can think about if that's where you want to be, or do you need to reevaluate your path? And I think what we see with energy infrastructure is a very interesting conundrum that's worth paying attention to for the water sector as it's sort of diversifying and going to distributed and incorporating some of these technological solutions along the way.
That's interesting, having been an energy editor now in the water space. Now I'm going to turn to Joaquin Esquivel's question, and this is a follow-up on something that Joe said. How do you best turn insurance programs, whether national flooding, private fire, or others, and their premiums from the current model of recovery after a disaster into a tool for resiliency, where the premiums and dollars instead go to the watershed scale solutions on water and fire, we'll say, that drive down risks and brings needed investments? Any examples elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, that's a tremendous question that is something I, am thinking about being in a think tank, since that's what I do. I don't honestly, if I had that answer, I probably wouldn't be on this panel right now, and I'd probably be retired or something, to be honest. And it's not just exclusive, again, to water. I know certainly in California with the wildfire issues, for sure, this is a very timely issue of, you know, how can we not just like respond to risk, but account for it in ways that we can make those forward-looking investments, but have the protections in place, right? So that communities feel confident that they can not just survive, but thrive, you know, ongoing. And so the extent to you know, that the insurance industry, which to be clear is kind of outside my my expertise per se. I defer to Nusha and Alessandra if they have specifics here, but it has to be hammered out. I think without a doubt, our current setup is just, it's just not working. And I would imagine if we can make progress on answering these questions in the water sector, perhaps this could have, you know, cross-sector, you know, implications for some of these same sort of disaster issues that so many regions are facing right now. I will just say that one of my colleagues, Shalini Vajhala, you can look up some of her publications on the Brookings site. She's written extensively on sort of this idea of sort of resilience, sort of risk response, how we begin to not just measure it, but sort of internalize it in how we pay and design our projects now. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about before of cost effectiveness, of not just sort of rebuilding the same stuff, but incentivizing sort of new designs, you know, new procurement strategies that create these projects that can absorb that risk, and that we can ensure that risk in ways that financially is sustainable for communities. But I'm sure Nusha or Alessandra maybe have more specifics on that.
I think you touched on it very well. I think that the challenge is, that's $1 million question for sure. But one thing I would say for an example is, you know, for many years, we have been trying to provide, FEMA has been providing resources for people to recover from flooding after various hurricanes. And I think I assume some of you have seen that recently they actually said they are going to fund managed retreat, moving people from you know, flood zones and moving them to different communities. That way they don't need to constantly every year going back and you know, fixing the homes, or actually leaving a lot of people behind, to be honest with you. So there's so many people who actually end up being suffering from these natural disasters and never recover. So I think that is, you know, that took a long time before we got to that point with flooding. And I'm hoping with fires, we'll move there much faster to sort of kind of shifting our reactive dollar spending to disaster to more proactive actions that would require investment before these disasters happen. And I would say, you know, some of the studies I have looked at have shown that for every dollar we spend beforehand to deal with natural disaster, we save $4 of, you know, recovery cost, which I think is actually underestimated. I think it's a lot higher, more valuable. With the insurance companies, I think the key is, again, we touched on this earlier, performance matrices. We have to be able to measure how these dollars are well spent if they're spent ahead of time, and would bring down the liability of these insurance companies if they actually invest the money ahead of time rather than later. And that calculation right now is not done. It's mostly focused on past disaster. So sort of trying to change, and I think this has been sort of repeating in this panel multiple times, different way of measuring success is key for unleashing money, for unleashing resources, and unleashing solutions that are more appropriate for this time.
That actually leads into this next question from Lyle Brecht. And Lyle is asking, have any of the panelists seen an approach to new development that embodies a new 21st century vision for water management, where water is a platform for economic growth and equity? Lyle is looking for specific language.
I'll kick it off. Related to some of the points I was talking about before on public and private collaboration on some of these issues. One that I'm sure some of our viewers are familiar with. There's Prince George's County outside of Washington led one of the first what's called a community-based public-private partnership, or CBP3, that looked to accelerate not just sort of more gray centralized infrastructure to handle flooding concerns, but actually distributed green infrastructure across the whole county to comply with an EPA mandate to reduce sort of their pollution, their water pollution, which is a very costly ask. And so the county was like, hey, we can't really handle this all ourselves. So how can we perhaps think of new ways to respond to this challenge, and in ways that can also improve our local economy? And so as part of this, they made it a requirement, and they worked with this group called Corbius and sort of this public or this private consortia of partners that would help design and maintain the projects in addition to helping build them. But it was a requirement of this partnership. They would use a certain portion of the projects for local minority and women-owned businesses to be involved in this process. So the sense that you're building out green infrastructure at scale that's distributed across not just like one sort of neighborhood, but a whole county to address an existential sort of climate challenge, that also is investing in the local community and is providing something we haven't talked too much about, but is important right now, where water has sort of, pun intended, the ripple effects, in terms of workforce development. That model, I think, provides interesting precedent to consider. Now, in terms of, as we've talked about, sort of costs and benefits, and is this going to pay off, and what are the long-term returns on this, both environmentally and economically, this is still a very new way to approach these issues. So I think we're only about 5 or so years out from when Prince George's County started this, and I know some other places across the country are thinking of similar collaborations. So these are going to be things worth sort of looking at, but that is one case where we have seen sort of this twofold model of addressing our environmental and water needs alongside some of our economic needs.
Did you want to chime in?
No, I just want to say one thing. The key about what Joe said, and actually we see that in San Francisco too. San Francisco has a ordinance that requires every building that's 250,000 square feet and larger to put a on-site reuse system in place, funded by the developer. And I think this what Joe mentioned, and this model, it just sort of highlights the key point of actually cost sharing opportunity with these private entities, and not necessarily privatizing our water system, but actually bringing them in as partners who actually make sure that they are investing in systems or marginal solutions that are needed for their growth, for being in a community, for being part of the community. And I think that's very important to make sure people are actually part of this process. This circle is very important.
I'm going to ask a question from Bob Hitchner. It's interesting. Bob notes that California is a great laboratory for how local water companies can respond to local water challenges, with 400 plus entities run by elected boards. California faces repeated drought and depleting groundwater resources. The challenge of climate is perfectly obvious to board members and to the electorate. Can the panelists give us some examples of local water boards that have viable long-term visions for how to address these climate water challenges? What are they doing? Are there many such water boards? Why or why not? Nusha, you may want to take that one. It's interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a very important question, and I think I'm not going to name names because I think it's just a challenge of going down the list. And alienating some people. But I think it's the important part of that question is this public boards that actually people do get elected in them. And these are sometimes short-term short terms and like 2-year terms. And often you see that some people come into it without necessarily knowing much about water, and then they learn eventually how complex it is, how hard it is, and how they need to deal with a lot of different elements. And with water boards, the challenge is sometimes people come in and they always promise that we are not going to raise rates, we are not going to do this, we're going to build all sort of infrastructure. And then they come in and see that's not necessarily what needs to happen to improve this water utility. There are so many other options that need to be put in place. And I think maybe I highlight one thing because I live in the city of San Francisco, so maybe I can highlight the city in a way. You know, this whole on-site reuse system that they put in place for large buildings, that was a strategy that was put in place by the staff and approved by the commission that so oversees it, which was, you know, sort of trying to understand what is worth investing in and what is worth to bring public into to invest on solutions with us. So while they're building a recycling plant on one side of the city because there's a space and capacity to do that, they realize in downtown San Francisco that's not something that's easily can be done. Right. So water boards can provide a lot of leadership and actually can be part of the solution rather than, you know, thinking about their next election and next political cycle to think about what is it that can help some of these communities to become more resilient, not necessarily thinking, how can I cut a ribbon and make sure I can get elected again? And that partnership between staff and making sure some of these solutions, innovative solutions are elevated is very, very important to make sure you have a successful board and you have a successful staff that can bring about some of these solutions. So trust is key.
Absolutely.
Go ahead,
I do
Alison.
agree with that, and I just would like to say that, you know, at the Water Foundation, we tend to focus on the water boards that are struggling more than the water boards that are doing well. So maybe that's something we could come up with some good examples in the future. But part of the challenge in the San Joaquin Valley of California, where there have been extensive decades-long lack of investment in infrastructure and ongoing drinking water challenges, has been that many times the local water board seats are just not even contested. So if there aren't enough people running, then, you know, you won't see your water board election on your ballot when you go to vote. So something like 82% of drinking water boards are uncontested races. These water boards end up being very not representative of the communities that live in these counties. And so you end up with kind of a perpetuation of this cycle of disinvestment, of lack of prioritization for communities who just don't have drinking water solutions. And so this has been a key intervention point of our investment plan at the Water Foundation, is looking into how do we publicize these elections more so people are even aware that they're coming up if you are interested in running for your local water board. They're a great springboard for kind of future political leadership as well. Are there opportunities where developing local water leaders who will prioritize the needs of their communities and make sure that there are sustainable, resilient solutions that actually meet their needs rather than just kind of continuing the status quo of financial challenges and lack of solutions, often due to political challenges rather than technical ones. So this is definitely a key intervention point. That I think it also leads into questions of the political will for things like consolidation. Consolidation has kind of been a big challenge in the water sector, something that's kind of been a bit of a third rail, a very political concern, but there are many water systems that are just too small to survive on the ratepayer base that they currently have. And so if you have new leadership that potentially is more open to consolidation, if it's the right solution for that community, can be another way to foster change. So we're really excited about improving equity and representation on local water boards in California and in other places.
There's one question here from an anonymous attendee. How do you think about the balance of affordability of water delivery with efficiency? I guess they're bringing up this rural-urban divide. Presumably urban delivery is more efficient with increases in population density, but at the same time, urban areas are becoming increasingly expensive to live in, potentially leading to more migration to rural areas. Going to the 21st century vision, are there embedded preferences toward rural urban development for updating our water infrastructure? Alessandra, did you want to field that one first?
Sure, I'll take a stab. I would say that I don't think that there's necessarily any preferences from the philanthropic sector in, incentivizing people to move to either urban or rural locations. I would say that we have seen challenges that don't necessarily, in drinking water quality, that don't necessarily split along the rural urban divide, but more along race and socioeconomic factor divides. So while, for example, in California, a lot of the focus on providing clean drinking water has been in rural areas in the San Joaquin Valley, there are communities in the greater Los Angeles region, for example, who have been struggling with legacy contamination, with unaffordability of water rates and struggling water systems that may have different challenges than the rural areas, but in some ways they're similar in the sense of water boards are no longer representing the needs of the local communities. There are financial challenges, lack of infrastructure investment. And so I don't necessarily know that I want to pit rural versus urban in this particular question, but rather say that, they have their own unique challenges in terms of what types of contaminants they face and their representation. But a lot of the times it does come down to racial and socioeconomic factors.
I'd say it's an important and timely question, and I'm sure part of it's motivated by the fact of all these news stories flowing around. I don't know if others have seen these, of like everyone's leaving cities, right, and moving to the suburbs. And I mean, I have some skepticism on that in the sense of, cities have been proclaimed dead in the past and have come back, but that's besides the point. I would say it brings up an important issue that here we are talking a lot about utility finances and system health, but that has to be seen in parallel with communities and sort of community economic conditions. And so what's true sort of in urban areas isn't like urban necessarily means higher capacity, greater ability to solve these issues. And rural means there's less population growth and an inability to solve these issues. But there are differences in the economies of scale in just how many utilities might be in a region. So the fact is, in many rural communities, utilities tend to be very, very small. You can count on one hand how many employees they have. And so they lack that economy of scale that some larger urban systems do have when it comes to, perhaps, as I was saying before, if they want to have new partnerships, that takes technical and staffing capacity to actually look out and make some of those new collaborations happen. If you're a small rural system and you have only a half dozen employees, I mean, their concern is just to keep everything running. They're not going to have a lot of time to necessarily look forward and solve some of these issues. So I would just say, it's not just urban versus rural, but really what are the economic conditions in these markets? And then how does that overlap with just the number of systems and the fragmentation of the systems across these markets, where we know that the ways in which we govern water don't match our political jurisdictions. Our watersheds do not match up with the city or county line necessarily. That's not how it works. And so it does lead to complications of how do we manage this and govern this. And as Alessandra and Nusha touched on very well, I mean, that has legal implications, regulatory implications at a state level, and even just across whole states. But it's an important question.
Yeah, and I would just say that I think both Joe and Alessandra touched on it beautifully. It's not a size issue in a sense. It's not the rural urban issue. It's actually more of a socioeconomic issue. And sometimes and of course there is, UN actually expect this to be not in the US, but generally expects more of the population is going to move to urban areas. And actually about 60% of those urban areas have not yet been built. which provides a lot of opportunity to rethink the way we do water. Actually, maybe we can be a lot more thoughtful in the way that we sort of build our water systems and avoid these once true systems that we dependent on, which are not climate friendly, not environmental friendly, and not human friendly in any ways. But I think the lack of capacity, financial and human capacity, is really, really key. And Joe brought this up multiple times. And I think that is what often leads into some challenges, especially if it overlaps with socioeconomic capacity. It leads to challenges with meeting water needs and water quality needs of some of these communities.
Well, everyone, I think that concludes our panel today. What a great discussion. Thank you so much for all of your input. And thank you, Stanford, for letting us take part.
Great. And thank you, Hannah. And thanks also to all of our panelists and the audience for participating. I hope that you found that informative. And if you did enjoy this webinar, I just wanted to also let you know that Woods is hosting another webinar tomorrow on wildfire, smoke, and health impacts, which I think will be equally informative and interesting. And you can find information for registration on our website. So thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.